Right, so I'm going to talk about the cultural turn. And I chose that title because around 1978, 1979, people began to use this term to signify the fact that we were moving into a new kind of era. And I remember when I first came across the expression cultural turn, I really reacted against it. And one of the reasons why I reacted against it was because the type of people that liked the cultural turn were the kind of people that turned me off. And they were the ones that actually saw a lot of positive significance in what they perceived to be a cultural turn. At the time, I foolishly believed that their optimistic prognosis of the growing influence of culture was going to be relatively short-lived. I didn't quite grasp exactly what was going on. It's not that they grasped it either. It's just that I just thought that was like a momentary fashion. But I think what was also very interesting, and this is something I'm not going to go into, is that precisely at the time when this cultural turn kicks in and people talk about it, was also the time when, within the social sciences in particular, but more widely, people began to talk about culture all the time. All of a sudden, individuals who used to talk about social issues began to redefine them as cultural ones. And people who in the past would have been what I would call social determinists, the ones that said that society determines everything, all of a sudden rebranded themselves as advocates of cultural determinism. Although cultural determinism is a much more fragmented concept in their eyes than the social one was, just because cultural determinism accepts the fact that there are different types of cultures. It's always a pluralized concept in the way that society wasn't, because you don't have societies, you have a society. Whereas with the cultural turn, it's a pluralistic, a pluralized kind of concept. So that's why I think it's interesting to talk about it, because with the cultural turn, what you also have is a shift in emphasis from a countercultural moment, the 2 decades beforehand, where you have a countercultural emphasis, which is really about calling into question and contesting and ultimately destroying the prevailing cultural values, which is what happens in the 60s and the 70s, to a moment when people begin to kind of engage in the task of creating a new culture, of building a new set of values. And in many respects, what's called the cultural turn was associated in the writings of a number of people with what they called was the post-material moment, when post-material values, and that was the language they used, when post-material values would displace values that were materialistic beforehand. That's the way that the whole shift was explained at that time. And the principal the principal emphasis of this shift from a materialistic culture to a post-materialistic culture was basically the discovery that environment and environmentally related issues were far more significant than people imagined. And indeed, a lot of people began to argue that environmentalism and the threat to the environment was the foundational issue of our times. I think that's very important to realize, because today when we talk about identity politics, when we see the subsequent development of cultural politics, we overlook its origins in this moment, and we overlook the fact that precisely the same people that began to become interested and invested their emotions in environmentalism were also the same kind of people that were very much interested in cultural identity-related matters. Now, I know you're all tired, and you've been listening to a lot of interesting ideas, and it may well be the case that at some point in my talk you're going to switch off and sort of think about shopping or something important like that. I think if you do that, then it's useful to think about my lecture. I want to kind of summarize my lecture by basically giving you a little model to think about. And if you remember that, then it's okay to forget about everything else that I say. And that little model, the way I kind of see it, is that the cultural turn and the kind of politics that emerges out of it is essentially in the business of calling into question every fixed point that existed within Western civilization. It's very much about busting the boundaries between men and women. It's about busting the boundaries between human beings and animals. It's about busting the boundaries between adults and children. It's about busting the boundaries between the private sphere and the public sphere. It's about busting the boundary between a citizen and a refugee, busting physical boundaries and borders between nation states, as well as the symbolic ones that exist within society. That's really what it's really all about, and that's what they've been engaged in and continue to be engaged in to this particular moment in time. But of course, human beings need boundaries, right? And even if you say, even if, as you now do, and this is what the cultural kind of moment, post-material cultural term brings about, even if you say that we don't like boundaries and we don't like borders because we like open borders, or we like cross-border crossings, or you say that you like metaphors that's got the word trans in them. You know, transnational is good, national is bad. Citizenship is bad, but transnational citizenship is good. Binaries, binary concepts such as good and bad and, you know, sort of moral boundaries are bad, and therefore we need a more trans, fluid, open sort of type of relationship. And you have to remember that this is the moment at which every time you use the word open, right, it's automatically seen as being ipso facto good. You know, open-mindedness becomes a key value, to the point at which everybody in this room thinks that being open-minded is good in and of itself. Not asking the question, open to what, right? Because that's always an important question. So all these kind of categories, which are kind of border-busting kind of categories, also invite the creation of new boundaries. And what we're now seeing, and this is the point I'm trying to make, what we're now seeing, and this is what the new kind of identity politics is all about, is the creation of new boundaries. Okay? So the same people that are against borders, they want open borders, are also the same people that demand the construction of safe spaces, right? Which is a boundary as well. You basically want a space where nobody can enter who's going to criticize you. The same people that want to open up this and destroy that particular boundary are also very much concerned about their personal boundaries, right? And there's a lot of discussion about, you know, minding, you know, about not entering people's personal boundaries. And you find that in all kinds of ways, what identity politics does is it constructs, and this is what's the original feature of the last period, is it creates new forms of boundary maintenance. I think a very good example of that would be the idea of cultural appropriation. Because cultural appropriation is really about policing culture. It's about making distinctions. Me, as a Hindu, have a monopoly over teaching yoga, right? Because yoga is part of my culture. And if you get some white bitch in England teaching that, that is an excursion upon my cultural identity. And you have similar discussions in food and hair. You know, I mean, the trivial way in which the policing of boundaries occurs in cultural appropriation is truly fantastic. And of course, we find that boundary creation is most prolific and most extensive in relation to language. Right? I mean, the way in which language is now policed, the words you can use that are beyond the boundary, and the words that you can use that is within the boundary, the number of expressions is just increasing all the time. In fact, it almost goes back to pre-capitalist times, to the feudal era, where you had to be really, really careful what kind of words you could get away with and what kinds of words you could use. So the point I'm trying to make is that, to put it most simply, is what we're seeing since '79 is a period of both the busting of symbolic boundaries, the kind of boundaries and fixed points that give meaning to life, kind of absolutely corroding and eroding them. And at the same time, and this is what identity politics is trying to do, is almost kind of semi-consciously creating new boundaries, new ways of settling what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. It's never good and bad, because that's too moral for these people. It's got to be appropriate and inappropriate. And sort of, what is kind of acceptable forms of behavior. Okay. Now, at the time, so when a cultural turn occurs, what you're seeing is an emphasis on culture, but the very emphasis on culture is mediated through a language and through a set of ideas that is extremely hostile to humanism. I mean, humanism, if you look at the books written in the 1980s, 1970s, they're almost without exception, they make fun of humanism. Humanism is seen as a silly, naive idea. Humanistic impulses are seen as a lie, almost, as a kind of cover for something else. This is the moment at which you kind of question materialistic capitalist society, but you do it in such a way that at the same time you also question the moral traditions that are linked with capitalism. So anti-religious ideals, anti-Christian ideals, anti-Western ideals, and in particular, this is the time when discussions of the Enlightenment become increasingly hostile. This is when they begin to coin the phrase that those of you that studied in universities will have come across. Have you ever heard of the concept, the Enlightenment Project? The very coining of the phrase, the Enlightenment Project, as if somehow we had this project, when in fact the Enlightenment was the accomplishment of a diverse number of individuals all pursuing very different, often contradictory ends. Right? Anyways, the Enlightenment Project is then seen as somehow the precursor of everything that is destructive and corrosive. So, at its worst, the Enlightenment is seen as the beginning of the slippery slope that begins with rationality and ends up in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. I mean, that's the way it's kind of generally kind of portrayed, that basically, as Zygmunt Bauman argues, the Holocaust could not have happened without the rationality and the science that was unleashed by this Promethean aspiration that the Enlightenment had. But what's also interesting about the cultural turn, and that's something that is very rarely recognized, is that the cultural turn is also intensely psychological. In many respects, I almost, in my own mind, see it as being a psychological turn, where you much more self-consciously and explicitly see the importance of emotions, of psychological states, where you increasingly see problems as emanating from emotional deficits, where you basically see the social issues, things like racism, the oppression of women, xenophobia, homophobia, as all markers for some kind of mental health kind of problem. It's at this stage in time that those kind of ideas gain authority. And as I mentioned and I suggested yesterday, these anti-rational and psychologistic sentiments are absolutely bitterly hostile to the idea of autonomy. I mean, I have not yet come across a single book, I'm sure there must be, there always is, I haven't come across a single book written in the English language by an Anglo-American academic that celebrates the liberal idea of individual autonomy. I'm not even talking about national and sovereignty, but individual autonomy. Neither of those ideals have any intellectual authority left. It's always, whenever people talk about autonomy, they always preface it by the phrase, the myth of autonomy. You know, it's just like that you have the myth of the Enlightenment, so it's the myth of autonomy. That's something that kind of comes forward. I would call this, this moment when you have, on the one hand, the calling into question of every single Western value, a kind of anti-humanist cosmopolitan moment. I think what's interesting is that precisely, and this is something that we need to pick up on, precisely at the moment when every value is called into question, right? You have two new values being sacralized, almost kind of created in this time. The first one is the sacralization of the Holocaust. For decades and decades and decades, what happened to Jewish people is totally ignored. There's very little discussion of the concentration camps in the 50s. I mean, it's just the concentration camp is just seen as like a refugee camp, more or less, except that more people died than in a usual refugee camp, right? And in the 60s, they begin to talk. But the first time that you have the use of the word Holocaust or the Shoah, what's called the Shoah, really kicks in the 70s. And from the late 70s, 80s onwards, every government in Western Europe begins to organize these Holocaust memorial days. You have anti-Holocaust denial laws occurring. All of a sudden, Auschwitz becomes this all-purpose symbol of evil. So we have one new value being created. We have the Holocaust becoming for the first time a symbol of evil, which sort of most Western governments can agree on. But you also need something that is good, that is the opposite of evil, occurring at that time. And in the 1970s, the good, the wholesome, that's something that we can love and like, as you would guess, becomes the environment. This is the moment when the environment becomes sacralized, when suddenly, sort of the environment is talked about pretty much in the way that Christian people used to talk about transcendence. In the Middle Ages, when Christian people talk about the resurrection, sort of that kind of almost mythical language, and certainly with the deep ecologist, it is virtually a form of political theology that they're developing in relation to the environment, to the point at which the anti-humanist trends also acquire a dehumanizing dynamic. Because as you know, with environmentalism, what you have is a phenomenally powerful sense of misanthropy, where people are talked about, human beings are talked about as this parasite upon the globe, and where the population problem becomes the fact that there's a population, and wouldn't it be better if you didn't have breeders, as they call them. I love that language, a breeder, who leave their carbon footprint behind. So on the one hand, you have this incredibly dehumanizing kind of moment, but at the same time as you dehumanize human beings, you also strip human beings of their humanity. And you do that with the invention and the escalation of animal rights. I think we tend to underestimate how important that is. Not because there's anything wrong with being nice to animals and stroking pussycats and all these things, it's perfectly all right. But when the boundary between the human and the animal becomes eroded and animals are seen as just basically, sort of furry versions of human beings, and there is no kind of sense of superiority or unique qualities, then you begin to run into problems. So that's really what the anti-humanist cosmopolitans bring into account. And the reason why I call them cosmopolitan is because by cosmopolitan I mean their love of everything that is unbounded. Right? They hate the nation, right? But their alternative to the nation is not a genuine universalism. They cannot really bring themselves to that. They just simply hate anything that is bounded, anything that is community-based. They particularly hate pre-political bonds between generations, between parents and children and their ancestors. And what they're trying to do all the time is to strip bare those bonds that link generations together and replace them with what they see as this transnational, universalistic sort of individual. And you get to the point where, their reality loses all bounds to the point at which it becomes a caricature. So, for example, if you look at the Italian political theorist Agamben, who is very popular at the moment, everybody's reading him. And, I think the reason why they love him is because he's incomprehensible. But nevertheless, when you decipher that pretentious writing, he makes the point that today, the only political category that has got any meaning left is the refugee. Right? So the refugee, right, displaces the citizen because, if you have a citizen, a democratic citizen, that's so exclusive, it basically a British citizen, by their very existence, excludes French people or African people or Australian people. And what they're arguing is that the refugee is really the only foundation around which a new kind of democratic politics can be reconstituted. Because only if we recognize that the refugee is like the future, the future creator of a new world, unless we recognize that we're going to fall back upon xenophobic and racist kind of politics. So those are the kind of ideas that kind of come about. And these are ideas and values that are unbounded, unmoored in the past. They're very open-minded to the point at which there is no limit to your openness. They are very fluid. And of course, they're very, very non-judgmental. And in a sense, what you also have is part and parcel of that is this reaction to the previous generations. I think when you think about, we discussed this yesterday, there's a reaction to the past. I think that reaction to the past often takes on a very strong kind of generational dynamic. And it's a very interesting generational dynamic that's never occurred before. And the reason why it's never occurred before is because in the past, whenever generations fought one another, so if you go back to ancient Greece, we have the first example of a generational conflict when Athens loses the Peloponnesian War. You find that the young people that are rebelling against their elders are basically rebelling against their elders on the ground that they can defend Athens better than the elders did. Whenever you have that Russian novel, I always forget his name, who wrote about fathers and sons, and all these things, there's a generational conflict there, but the younger generation does not call into question in a fundamental way the values of their parents. They're actually saying that we're able to give meaning to those values in a much more meaningful way than ever before. But now what you've got is something very strange, which is basically, and it's most clearly exemplified by what's it called? Extinction. What do they call them? Extinction Rebellion. Yeah, I always stutter when I try to explain that because it's so crazy. Whenever you listen to those kinds of things, what they're saying, their politics is about telling us how horrible previous generations were. The adults messed up things for little, is it Olga or whatever her name is, the little girl, the 16-year-old, Greta, yeah. Little Greta, becomes this mouthpiece for this kind of resentment against older people. And the whole of the environmentalist politics is about the fact that it's not about anything kind of constructive. It's about somehow reacting against all the mistakes that previous generations made, who simply took the earth for granted and did not put anything back in. It's a real kind of, basically it's fixing the problems of the past rather than dealing with the problems of the present. It's a continuous series of lectures. And of course, that kind of reaction exists in all domains of human experience. The main architect, the main theoretician of the cultural turn is a man called Ronald Inglehart. I don't know if you come across him. He is one of the social theorists in the late 70s, early 80s. He's alive even now, who writes about the new social movements, the new ways that the new social movements are thinking. And he's the one that talks about the fact that these new social movements are adopting post-material values. Now, why is it that people are adopting post-material values? Why is there a cultural turn? He argues, this is already in the late 70s, and the versions of the argument keep reoccurring in the next 20 years. He argues that the conditions of peace, economic security, and unparalleled affluence, which were experienced by a part of the baby war boom in advanced Western societies, has led to a sizable group of privileged individuals who are able to place a high priority on satisfying post-material needs. In other words, what he's saying is that we now live in a very secure environment, and this generation of environmentalists, this new generation of young people, because they're economically relatively sort of secure, are no longer interested in material survival or in material insecurity. They're interested in self-expression. They're interested in sexual equality. They're interested in sexual experimentation. They're interested in self-actualization. And I think what he's really saying is that what you have is a situation where this secure, wealthy generation develops cultural politics, post-material politics, in a way that's quite different than before. In contrast to the rest of society, the poor people, the working class people, somebody that Hillary Clinton will later on call deplorables, those kinds of people who are still interested in bread and butter economic issues. So he's locating this difference between two types of people. Now, when Engelhardt is writing, he is morally neutral in the way he describes the difference between people that today we call aware, and those people who are unaware of anything. I mean, just completely kind of reeking with prejudice and xenophobia, who are of the lower order. He's morally neutral because he phrases this thing in terms of economic security. That's the basis for that. However, as time goes on, sort of with the passing of time, this moral neutrality between these two kinds of people gives way to more than a hint of moral condemnation. So more recently, when you're discussing the irrational populists, the Brexit types, and people who vote the wrong kind of a way, when you're describing them, then you begin to bring in a kind of a language of morality. So for example, very recently, Pippa Norris and Ronald Engelhardt wrote a book, which I think came out earlier this year. And basically, they explain Brexit and explain the rise of populism in Europe and the election of Trump in America, because they all put them all together. It's all the same thing. In their eyes, they see that as a backlash. Poor people, uneducated, xenophobic people are backlashing against these very sensitive post-materialist types, who are not interested any longer in kind of grubby, materialistic kind of values. And basically, the way they write, what they really argue is that authoritarian populism, which is some people like me, is the consequence of what they call long-term generational shift in values. They say, as younger generations have become richer, more educated, and more secure, they've adopted post-materialist values that emphasize secularism, personal autonomy, diversity at the expense of religiosity, and at the expense of traditional family structures and conformity. And they then go on and say the older generations, again, people like me, have become alienated. I don't know why I've become alienated, but I have become alienated, effectively, in their words, becoming strangers in their own land. I think that's an expression of their hope rather than the reality. And they basically say, while the traditionalists are now numerically the smaller group, in other words, old codgers like me are the smaller group, they vote in greater numbers and they're politically active. right? So that's the explanation. So the reason why populism occurs is because you still have the remnants of these older generations, are still steeped in, kind of hundreds of years of prejudice, and they vote in larger numbers. That's the basic argument that's being sort of put forward. And they basically argue that what we're seeing, and again, this is very interesting. He says, in those places where you have multicultural settings, in the urban settings, where you have all these young people streaming into London or into New York, into San Francisco, because it's a more of a heterogeneous, multicultural setting, people vote against populism. But in those places, like the small towns or the northern towns, where society is still relatively more homogeneous, in other words, where the organic ties still exist, they tend to vote for the deplorable populists. I don't know if you noticed, but one of the unstated values that comes up in this debate by identity politicians is they hate homogeneity. Have you noticed that? Whenever they use the word homogeneous, it's ipso facto a condemnation. Imagine a homogeneous community. So the argument is that heterogeneity or difference is by definition superior. It's kind of a moral, and if it was really brought home to me absolutely clearly. I don't know if I told you this story, but I used to live 15 years ago in a small village, not for very long, in Kent. I thought I'd try it out. And a couple of African guys and Afro-American guys came who I know from before because they were interested in some research I did in Africa in a different life that I had in the past. And so they come to the village, they kind of look around, and this white woman that came with them says to me, Frank, I feel very uncomfortable in this village. And I says, well, why do you feel uncomfortable? They says, well, it is very homogeneous, right? It is very homogeneous. So I look, this is a small village in the middle of Kent. If I go to Botswana, right, and visit a village there, I do not expect to see very many English faces, right? That's not, and just because I don't see people like myself in that Botswana village would not necessarily make me feel uncomfortable. But she didn't get it, she didn't really quite understand. But you could really see that heterogeneity becomes ipso facto an important value. And I think the reason for that, I haven't got time to go into this, is that when you have heterogeneity and a multicultural setting, then by definition, there is more scope for identity politicians to manage and to administrate and to kind of become the experts that tell us and preach to us as to how we should relate to one another. So you got that occurring. And basically what Engelhardt is really getting at is he's trying to explain, but because he's part of it, he really can't. Is how it comes about, what part and parcel of this attempt to find a new way of being, having rejected the old, you ultimately have to opt for the sacralization of identity. Identity at that point becomes everything. And I think, and this is a point that I think Ben was bringing out earlier on, but I think it's a really important point, which is that when you sacralize identity, you have to spoil other people's identity. Right? It's not the case that you just celebrate identity and they say, even though they lie and they say we love all identities, they don't. Right? Because what you have, as you're celebrating some identity, is a spoiling of others. So when you have the feminine-masculine counterposition, it's very, very clear that male identity is at the very least morally inferior, or if not more than that. And you have the new language occurring where people's personality and people's very being is bound up with an identity that defines them, but these identities convey a moral condemnation. So for example, when people use the word white attitudes, you got white attitudes. It's not neutral, so they don't say, oh, that's interesting. That's a white attitude, right? What that they mean is that white attitude is by definition somehow flawed, somehow prejudiced, somehow racist. There's a number of meanings that conveys. Or when you use the word, one of my favorite words, which I identify as heteronormativity. Right? Heteronormativity. The term heteronormativity doesn't say, oh yeah, it's interesting. You know, heteronormativity is a very interesting neutral concept. It basically conveys within it an aspiration towards sexual small-mindedness, inability to sexually experiment, you know, living according to the puritanical values of 4 or 5 centuries ago. Or another favorite expression that I suppose I would describe myself is toxic masculinity, right? It's interesting because you might imagine that toxic is working as an adjective with masculinity, but actually what they really mean is that all masculinity is toxic. I mean, that, it's very rarely the case that you have, sort of great masculinity. These are the masculinity that we celebrate. The very term toxic masculinity serves as an incitement to emasculating people. I mean, that's the good man, the one that has got no masculine features left. Now, these ideals of culture obviously come about from the universities. Universities is the place where people talk about culture the most. That's where a lot of the language, that's where a lot of the ideas kind of come about. And I think it's important to say that although they are very influential, these ideals, they haven't yet become coherent, systematic, as I was suggesting to you yesterday. I think that the post-material, anti-traditional, cosmopolitan, anti-humanist sentiments have not yet cohered into a system of value. They work as a clandestine ideology, which is very, very rarely spelled out. And I think that the way that it works is that, sort of you have kind of symbolic distinctions being experimented with, but they haven't yet cohered into a powerful force. So in many respects, if I want to describe somebody as very desirable, somebody as really wonderful from an identity politics point of view, if I want to say that you are great, what do I call you? What's the name that I use? Well, the name they use is she or he is really aware. Have you heard that expression? They're aware. It's an interesting concept because awareness, I did a Google Ngram search when it kind of began to be used, because people were not described as being aware, sort of in the 18th, 19th century, or most of the 20th century. It comes in at a certain point when this kind of cultural war takes off. Being aware is, by definition, a limited description in the sense that you don't know what they're aware about. They're just aware, right? What are they aware about? There isn't, it's very rarely the case that you spell that they are aware of danger or they're aware of the importance of national sovereignty. Just being aware leaves open, it leaves in the air, what it is that you're about. And it's a wonderfully important concept. And of course, awareness as a category that you describe people with also serves the function of creating not only two classes of people, those who are and those who aren't, but also provide some individuals with the authority, with the professional and cultural authority to determine what awareness means in this particular case. And I think we now find that there are millions of these institutions where professionals tell you, and you get training in awareness. I don't know if any of you had the misfortune to go to one of these sensitivity training or awareness or diversity training. Kind of. I don't want to make any jokes about it because they are dark that I could make, but it is done by people who can barely spell the word aware, right? I mean, they really struggle to get the W in there instead of the we, sort of, and they are the ones that are, teaching you these kind of different forms of sensitivity. Imagine going to a class on consent, right? Imagine these schmucks explaining to you what consent means, whereas we all know, if you have any philosophical training, that consent is not something that you do in accordance to administrative rule. Consent comes through the interaction at that particular moment. So basically, what you've got are sort of norms being created, like awareness, that both try to sort of give a positive sort of set of values to this new culture. But in the very course of doing that, they are continually also breeding suspicion towards anybody that isn't really part and parcel of that. I think that's what the symbolic distinctions between people do. I have to say, again, I haven't got time to do that, but that when you make these symbolic distinctions between two types of people, it is as violent and it is as potentially dangerous as when you make distinctions between good and bad races. You know, as when you make distinctions between good people and bad people. I mean, these lifestyle distinctions that are being drawn through the new kind of morality that's being created are no less intolerant than the old ones. How much time we have got left?
None.
Hey?
No more. Finishing.
All right.
Wind up now.
Now, I'm just going to jump over everything. And so basically, the really difficult question becomes, and this is something I'd like you to think about and maybe struggle with, not just today, but for some time to come. The really difficult question to answer is, how is it that in spite of the absence of doctrinal clarity, in spite of the absence of a system of thought, somehow what's called correct thinking emerges? There's a kind of correct thinking that we all know exists in every aspect of our life. When you go to a dinner party in Islington, you know exactly what is correct and what is incorrect. I know all the time because my wife kicks me under the table as I'm about to open my mouth to basically prevent me from saying certain things. That's because she knows what the correct thinking is, and we do that in work and everywhere else. And where does that correct thinking come from? It's a very difficult question to answer because unlike other forms of correct thinking, which are bounded or based on a certain system of ideas, a religion or a doctrine, this one doesn't seem to have that. It's very, very sort of clandestine. And it seems to me that the way to understand where this correct thinking comes from is to understand that what we have is a situation where, in a sense, the animosity and the resentment that the new kind of cultural values create and the attempt to sort of kind of harness that resentment into a kind of a way of life does create a certain negative form of ideology, which more or less becomes quite central to people's life. I think that the way in which correct thinking, the way that kind of comes about, and the reason why it is so plausible, is because underpinning this anti-humanist element that's contained within the cultural turn is this continuous demand to police and to control humanity. I think the misanthropic dynamic that is thrown into the mix in this situation, where human beings are seen as having these series of psychological deficits, which results in all kinds of oppressive behavior, continually invite some way of controlling that, some way of rewarding those people who are able to overcome those deficits by being aware, whilst at the same time punishing those people who are not able to sort of make that kind of a change. And I think that the correct thinking, in a sense, which exists principally on the linguistic plane, it's very much about the language and the words that you are kind of using, is something that is still rather unstable in the way that it kind of works itself out. So basically, the conclusion that I've kind of come to is that correct thinking comes about through the marriage of the therapeutic underpinnings of the cultural turn with the technocratic and social engineering policies that emanate from that. And it is through the institutionalization of the social engineering and the technocratic ambitions that occur that correct thinking succeeds in being so powerful. I think the best example that I can think of, which is quite unprecedented in the rapidity with which it's kind of spread into the popular consciousness, is gender-neutral trans ideology. And when you think about it, that a conservative government in this country, at least a conservative government in name, can so rapidly create a situation where it does become the truth, the incontrovertible truth, where people, sort of are so ready to, at least sections of society become so ready to embrace it, where a lot of parents boast about the fact that, yes, my child does not have a gender identity at the moment because I'm preparing them for any eventuality. When that kind of shift can occur so fast, you can really see how correct thinking becomes a possibility with this heady mixture of a therapeutic imagination being enforced through a governance that is committed to social engineering and to technocratic solutions.
Thanks so much, Frank. So I'm just going to take as many people as I can, but bear in mind that this is the final session. We won't be able to get through as much as we want to. But I'm going to start there with Harley.
Thanks. Just thinking back to the first session yesterday, where you talked about things like diversity lacking moral depth. I'd say they also contain, because of that perhaps, they contain the seeds of conflict and possibly of their own destruction. So just an example, my company I work for, we've just all had to do 6 hours of online ethics training, basically a tick box type exercise. But whenever it came to a definition of something like diversity, the statement they gave was full of contradictions. It's really obvious they haven't thought about it for very long. Very easy for them to start espousing these values, but it's taken a matter of weeks for the conflicts to start arising when people take them at their word, and all kinds of things arise from that. Ben earlier talked about diversity being the system which society now reproduces itself through. It doesn't seem to be doing a very good job of that. Is this going to just collapse, or where will it go?
Okay, thanks. Can it go right to the back, and then can that come here? Yeah.
Right. Frank, the question is, how do you build contact with these people who consider you a populist and a dinosaur? So what's the point where you build rapport and you start thinking where you can start talking to them and maybe see where they come from, or maybe how they can change their mind, or you change your mind?
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah.
An example, I suppose, my daughter, who's 15, was put on the prom committee at school, and some of the children wanted to have an African night for the prom night, and then they all decided that that wasn't possible to do because they wouldn't be allowed to dress in African clothing because that would be cultural appropriation, and so therefore it was cancelled. So it's more, in a way, it's a silly example, but it does seem to show, one, how complicated life becomes for young people then in navigating this world, but then also kind of how they just get around it and adopt, navigate it. It just becomes part of their life, but they are oppositional at the same time as accepting of it.
Okay, thanks. So somebody's got the microphone. Can that go to Vanessa? Wave your arm around. Yes.
Frank, I agree with your every word, and I realise at that point I ought to sit down. But I can't resist the temptation just to add one point which I don't think has been brought out over the last 2 days, and that's that it seems to me the elites have never before had so little authority over ordinary people as they've got today. And in fact, insofar as they've got authority at all, it's all based on a naked exercise of power, this idea that you cannot say that. And that works, of course, because people are frightened to speak out. But we do know that the majority of people do not subscribe to the ideas of today's elite. And I think that's an opportunity for us that needs exploiting. It needs exploiting by a political party. And I wondered, Frank, if you were in the business of setting up a new party like you did 30 to 40 years ago, and you might want to call it UKUP, the United Kingdom Populist Party. I think if you did that, it would have a great future.
Thank you. Advice all the way. Right, okay, yeah.
Just in terms of Agamben and the refugee, obviously today that's far too exclusionary. So if you look at the Global Compact for Migration, there's not only the trying to break down that relationship between the citizen and the migrant, but also the category of refugee and migrant. So you've got the attempt to move away from any sort of judgment and a preference for the unencumbered self of the migrant, and how the migrant is unencumbered by family, community, state, nation, or tradition.
Thank you. Jacob. So the way I'm going to do it is Jacob, Toby, I think that's Dominic, is it? Frank, then I'll come back out for another round, yeah?
Thanks. I especially found interesting and useful this idea of correct thinking, because it seems to relate quite strongly to two of the concepts we talked about this weekend as well, one of them being the notion of bad faith and people acting in bad faith. But also when Tim raised the idea of what Heidegger calls sort of das Man, or the they, or the amorphous people who do the thinking on behalf of us. And the reason why I think that relates is because what those concepts are getting at to an extent, even though they're terribly individuated and don't quite get at it in the right way, the notion of correct thinking seems to function as a way of avoiding, or you might say, like the problem that dare not speak its name. And the reason why it's so prevalent is because so many people cannot confront that problem that dare not speak its name, which is, what do we stand for? What positive program or views or ideology might we put forward? And that's why the ideology of today is, as you characterize it, a negative ideology. It exists in the absence of being able to answer that question that dare not speak its name.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Frank, I just wonder if I could ask you to comment on the form of moral boundary. So you've introduced this idea of boundary, which is really fascinating, and Basil Bernstein looked at this within education in his sociology. And one of the things sort of driving from Bernstein, one of the points he made, is that a sort of progressive moral boundary, which seems quite similar to the kind of moral boundary you're talking about today, is precisely destabilizing of the self, because it focuses on the internal psyche of the person as opposed to external action, and it's disorienting because it's invisible. It's not an explicitly stated form of moral boundary. It's an invisible moral boundary. And I just wonder if there's anything to sort of mine in, maybe not so much defending all of the old boundaries of the past, but us having a role in actually explaining the emergence of a new form of moral boundary, which is very destabilizing and disorienting towards people because of its invisibility.
Yeah, Frank, on your points about the power of environmentalism and particularly moral condemnation, I just wanted to make a quick point about an important shift I've noticed recently related to the discussion we've had this weekend about the estrangement from the past. So a few weeks ago, I got into a debate with a scientist who's a leading author on the International Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, who accused me of being a climate denier, and which obviously is a kind of very extreme form of moral condemnation. Now, in the past, I have been accused of this before, and I point out, well, in the past, you know, I've recognized in my writings that there has been a slight rise in global temperatures and that human beings have contributed to greenhouse gases towards that. And that previously would have been enough to put aside many of those condemnations about being a climate denier. And the scientist turned around to me and he said, no, the debate is now not about the past, it's about the future, except there's very little debate. Basically, we all agree now there will be a climate catastrophe. The only place where there's any debate is about when that will happen. And if you deny that that will happen, you are a climate denier. And I thought I could point out to him that science should be based on past conclusions rather than crystal ball gazing. But it seems now that unless you agree that there will be a climate catastrophe and adapt your behaviour and outlook accordingly, you are now a climate denier. And then just about a week after I had that debate, you know, Prince Charles comes out and says that we have 18 months to save the world. So
I don't think we can underestimate the power of this kind of shift away from the past towards the future and the level of moral condemnation anyone will face who questions that.
Yeah, yes, very interesting points. On the question of moral boundary, I think you mentioned Bernstein. I mean, Bernstein had this idea of invisible pedagogy, I believe, which is a very rich idea, because what Bernstein is really getting at is that in many respects the invisible pedagogy that exists in schools can be even more coercive than when you discipline explicitly, when you tell Johnny that they're bad and you make them stay, sort of after everybody's gone home, because the invisible pedagogy relies upon subliminal psychological techniques, sort of what Foucault calls, techniques of the mind as a way of controlling things. And I think the reason why Bernstein's idea is interesting is because it relates to the invisibility of correct thinking and what underpins and drives kind of correct thinking. And if the point is, you raise this question about moral boundaries. The thing about moral boundaries, of any boundary, moral boundary is the one that you cannot invent. You cannot create morality, by having a committee meeting, because if you do that, what you end up with is what I think Harley was talking about earlier on, is these ethics discussions. And ethics has become this entirely kind of artificially created, sort of very pragmatic, very instrumentalist use of philosophy in order to deal with problems, kind of problem solving. Now, moral boundaries are really quite important to me, and it's the one area where I think all of us can agree on the importance of protecting and defending and maintaining the moral boundaries that are imminent in Western civilization. I don't think that, even if you're an atheist like me, you still have you're still invested in maintaining those moral boundaries, because they are the only medium through which human experience can be endowed with meaning. But also, it's the only way that we can protect our humanity, because one of the boundaries, if you begin to unpick moral boundaries, as is the case at the moment, then what you also do is you unpick the most fundamental moral boundaries that humanity has come up with over the centuries, which is the boundary between people's inner life and outer life. And one of the things that was recognized ever since Luther and the Reformation is that the inner life is something that must remain untouched by external power. I mean, and later on, when you read John Locke's little pamphlet on tolerance, he makes the point that tolerance presupposes that we allow people to pray to the gods that they want to have their religious beliefs, because that is something that an external order first of all cannot control, but even if it could, that would be undesirable. And certainly, both in the Christian and the Judaic, and also in the secular tradition, there's always been a recognition that there is something special about what some people call conscience, right? What people like me would rather call our inner voice, something to do with things that are internal to us. And I think what has happened, and it hasn't been noticed, is that as the moral boundaries have been unpicked one by one, as you have the censoring of our language, the words that you can use, then at a certain point, you're not just simply satisfied with telling people what they can and they cannot say. You also come to the point where you demand to have the right to dictate what people should feel. That's what therapeutic culture does, but not just demand what they should feel, but how they should think, what they really are all about. And that's one of the interesting things that have occurred, because people today are being condemned not for what they've done. In other words, not for what they've done, but what they kind of unwittingly do. Right? I mean, microaggression, the crime of microaggression, is not about the fact that you were actually physically aggressive, you hit somebody, that you were aggressive towards others. It's the fact that you are unwittingly conveying sentiments that are deemed to be the characteristic of somebody who's not aware. I mean, the concept of unwitting racism. Right? You could be married to a person of a different race, right? You could have mixed-race children, but you could also be still unwittingly racist, because somehow you express sentiments that are in the air. And of course, once you begin to go into the realm of people's inner lives and demand to control their inner lives, which is far more than anything that any totalitarian system has ever been able to do. Once you begin to move in that kind of direction, then of course the protection that, that civilization has given to people by making a very clear distinction between inner life and outer life, which has been the central foundation for tolerance and ultimately for the creation of the private and the public sphere, that will be gone altogether. So the stakes are actually very, very high here, which is why I say, and this might sound a little bit kind of conservative, that we do have to conserve, right? And because conservatism isn't just Tory party and that kind of stuff. It's also about conserving certain legacies that were central to the development of human civilization, and the moral boundaries that have organically developed are ones that we put at risk, and if we kind of put them at risk, then I think that constitutes a very, very dangerous precedent, which is why today, for the first time, a lot of people in Europe, in the European Union in particular, are actually telling us that conscience and the right to conscience and to be able to allow your actions to be dictated by your conscience is a passé, old-fashioned thing that they can poo-poo and no longer take seriously.
Okay, last round then. So anyone who wants to speak? Okay. So in the sorry, I can't see where the microphone's on now. So in the front here, if you wouldn't mind, yeah. And then there's two people there, yeah.
What you just said is so true of my experience of working in China. I travelled to China quite often with a Christian, a Canadian Christian, and he's sort of a born-again type. And he loves going to China because he likes to go to the churches there and meet people who are expressing their religion as an act of transgression or sort of against the authorities. And I kind of couldn't understand why he loved it so much. I thought he was being like a missionary. But then when I come back home with him, I realized that he's got a very peculiar experience in that colleagues will tell me that I should not trust him because he has this inner conscience. So there's a kind of campaign against him within the university because he holds a set of ideas which are sort of so profound and determining the way he thinks about things that they say it's suspicious. So they don't even criticize him for what he says. They criticize him for not saying certain things that he believes, that they know and suspect he believes. So that's really how strongly that process has gone on within the university and why Christians, I think, are so defensive when you meet them. But I had a question which was about homogeneity, because if you look at that idea of homogeneity, like Sennett talks about that as a problem in The Uses of Disorder, which I can't remember, but that's early 60s that discussion takes place. And I kind of think that section of the sort of liberal left, intellectual left, they actually introduced the idea of sameness and homogeneity as something that prevents the psychological development of the individual and stunts socialization. And so I'm kind of thinking I'm a bit ambiguous about Lasch, because I see him in that context as well. Like, Lasch seems to explain so many things about the contemporary personality, but in a way, the things you're criticizing, I feel like they come from Sennett and Lasch at the same time as they're making a critique of it in that early period.
Actually, Frank, I just wanted to ask you something to add to the questions, which was on homogeneity. I can never say it. You know, it's kind of when you're trying to argue against those people who demonize it, do you have to defend it? I mean, you know, do you have to make a virtue of the things that are demonized? Because that sometimes is what happened. And, you know, small village, homogeneous life is fine. I don't want to demonise it, but I don't want to necessarily say, and this is the place that we should all, this is where you can find meaning. So I just wanted to know how you dealt with that. I mean, that's only just one example, but it happens all the time. And I do think that people like Goodhart and so on, you end up in a situation where you end up saying, therefore I will make a virtue of this, which is being demonised by those people. And so I just wondered how you felt about dealing with that. Right, okay. Yeah, so there's 2 hands down there. I can't see anyone. So there's 2 hands. Oh, yeah, take him while we're there. Yeah. Where's the other microphone? So there's 2 hands down there. Oh, yes, and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
A brief question, really. It's pretty clear that, looking back on it, in the former Soviet Union, the attempt to use censorship to control people's inner life didn't work.
No.
Not in the slightest. And so in the same way, I wonder whether today the attempt of, right think to control how people think and feel, whether it can really succeed. I can certainly see that it puts tremendous pressure on people, that people are aware of almost carrying a burden. Now, one example would be, I've come across quite a large number of young people in their 20s and early 30s who feel that resolving the climate crisis is their personal responsibility. So they stop eating stuff and they'll stop buying particular things. And I think that they experience it as a kind of a pressure, or a fairly intolerable kind of a pressure. But outside of individual examples like that, people seem to plough on. But lots and lots of people just get on with it despite everything. So isn't there a parallel between that and the failure of East Europe, the Soviet bloc to control people's thoughts?
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, there's 2, yeah.
Yeah, Nick. I'm absolutely fascinated by this, and my question is really a simple one. Really, you talk in terms of not really understanding where is this stuff coming from, who's driving this. I mean, it's just you're an academic, and this place, as far as I can see, is chock full of amazingly intelligent academics. Is there not a certain amount of academic research going on now into who are the people who are coming in and driving this agenda on right thinking, correct thinking in organisational terms? I mean, as an ex-civil servant, it was becoming very obvious to me within various bits of the civil service that, this kind of thing was beginning to gain traction. And it was a resource issue for taxpayers because more and more people within the organisation were being diverted away from, in the Foreign Office, from, things like conflict resolution in Mozambique to issues around right thinking. So there's a resource issue there. And I'm assuming there will be some research that says these are the kinds of organisations, or this is where the people who are coming into HR departments who are driving these agendas are coming from. Cui bono, these are the people who are being paid to drive this. And I'd be very interested to see the results of that.
Okay, only if you're desperate to speak and we're running out of time. Who's got the microphone? Thank you, yeah.
Well, just quickly on your question, Nick, yes, there are people looking at that in both Britain and abroad, but they are working generally in isolation, and they're not the go-to researchers that the new think tanks and quangos and third sector bodies go to. And they're the ones that kind of have their hands to the wheels of power, and they tend to go to their own researchers to generate what they want. I just wanted to very quickly add something to Toby's point, having brought up Bernstein, which is that there's a knowledge dimension as well. There's a beautiful, very short essay he wrote on the trivium and the quadrivium, where he talks about when he's considering the changes within academia and the curriculum and the weakening and loosening of boundaries within the academic disciplines of knowledge. And he notices, his conclusion is that for the first time after a centuries-old tradition, what is being lost is the idea of cultivating the inner as a prerequisite for mastery of the outer. And in that sense, it's just a beautiful phrase, and it does seem to me to sum up the kind of way the psychological inner thing is also kind of fits the new political agenda of lowered expectations of humanity.
Thank you. Yeah.
The best illustration I've come across of the combination of the therapeutic and technocratic is in the university I work in, which is the forced imposition of what are called mental wealth modules, which are meant to be a career passport to the fourth industrial revolution, I wish, and the students are meant to feel good about themselves while they do it. This is being imposed in every program at every level, and I'm just going to have to leave before they make me do one. I've got a question, though. Do you have any space for the idea of transcendence in what we ought to be doing in response? I rather like it, religious or not, because I think even if it is or has been religious, the idea contains the possibility of becoming more than we already are. And so I'm not opposed to sacralization per se. I'm opposed to the sacralization of identity, because that is to make sacred what people already are, and what the hell is the point of that?
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, is the transgender issue a kind of Trojan horse we can use to smash everything? I asked this, I was talking about this lunchtime, but I asked this because it seems the most mad, seems to have the most impact on people, seems to have an impact on children. It's got huge opposition in terms of the percentages of people who think aspects of this are wrong. And feminists, a number of feminists are opposed to it. So it just seems like to be one of those issues you can actually get stuck into, whereas issues like racism, sexism, homophobia kind of don't seem to have the same capacity to try and wedge into these issues.
Actually, I disagree with that. I disagree that that's what will happen, but one of the things that's often said to me is that they will eat themselves. You know that point about you go to the dinner party, you don't know what the rules are, and actually the people who are so woke they know the rules then break the rule of somebody who's more woke than them at the dinner party, and you think, God, I'm safe. Actually they're fighting amongst themselves. I've got away with it, because it moves all the time, and then it becomes a joke where people who are concerned think, oh, they'll just blow themselves up, they'll implode, they'll eat themselves. You know that phrase, they'll eat themselves. But I think that just ends up making us complacent, you know, but I'm just saying that is generally the way people see it. It'll go so far that they won't be able to maintain it, and whilst enjoying it in a sectarian way when that occurs, it seems to me to be overly nihilistic and not particularly constructive a way to view it. But any thoughts? Anyway, last contribution, then Frank, and then I've got some announcements, so don't all rush off.
I just wanted to ask about environmentalism, going on from Dominic's point. There was a more or less thing on Radio 4, and it was something had come out about somebody had claimed that the insect population was dying, and more or less looked at the research and said there were like 3 pieces of research, and they were all rubbish, and they showed that they said to the professor who'd come out with this research, you know, this is the basis on which you're saying this, and he said, I know, but we know it's happening. And the thing about environmentalism is Radio 4 themselves have said it's a closed question. So this isn't fluid. This is something that's stuck, and we have to accept that this is the truth, that we have to deal with the problem of environmentalism. How do we crack that?
Anything, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, Claire's point is really important. I don't think it's good enough to rely on people eating themselves, nor is it good enough just to make fun of them. I know a lot of people like to make fun of these different identity groups, and because they behave so idiotically, and the stupid language they use, you know, you can get a good laugh. But none of that is going to be effective in countering their influence. Don't think for 1 minute that that the people who find trans ideology grotesque today will have the same views 2 years from now. I mean, look at the speed with which gay activists who used to oppose gay marriage all of a sudden found something beautiful in getting married, and all of a sudden the people's attitude just changes in a very short period of time. So to be trans culture, I think that people will buy into that, or at least will acquiesce to that more and more. And I think that until you're able to put forward a humanist account of you know, what it means to be a human, and what is that kind of genuinely binds us together, and really go forth and argue for that in public, you're not going to be able to contain this, because don't think for 1 minute that it's being exhausted. I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the years ahead. You know, the dark ages have not yet come in the way that it could possibly come. Because once these things acquire traction, once people lose their confidence, entire confidence in being able to deal with this, once the major political parties all accept it into their agenda, then there is very little space left, and it isn't just going to be environmentalism that is beyond discussion. I think everything will be beyond discussion. So
this is the last session, Frank, and we're going to leave us with Extinction Rebellion, suicidal thoughts. Bit of hope somewhere, please.
No, sorry about that, but unless you know the scale of the problem, you will not have the incentive to do something about it, right? In other words, there's no ground for complacency, but there's a lot to fight for. There's a lot of possibilities, for the very simple reason that this is as yet an unformed, incoherent, sort of clandestinely constructed set of ideas. So I think, and precisely because of that, it is vulnerable to a positive, not a negative kind of alternative. And that, what I'm really calling for with you here is to take part in the project of constructing some kind of positive alternative to this, which all of us can get involved in, because all of us are having to go to ethics committees, all of us are being told to behave in this way or in that way. And I think all of us in those circumstances could set a personal example by being subversive and defining them. Just two small points. One is, we all know who are the beneficiaries of this, because every organization has got these idiots who are diversity experts. They're the ones that are the mental health sort of coordinators. But I don't think that it's good enough to confuse these who are the beneficiaries of this culture with the creation of that culture. In other words, we're talking about two different things here. It's very easy to identify those individuals who are on the wrong side. It's much more difficult to be able to explain, because of the nature of the cultural struggle that is going on, the reasons and the dynamic forces that give them the authority at this particular stage in time. And that's what we're trying to do here, is to develop the arguments that unpick that cultural authority in a very effective way. On homogeneity, I think it's important not to be defensive. If people want to live in homogeneous communities, if they want to live in communities that's inhabited by people that are just like them, fine. At the same time, we don't want to sacralize that. We don't want to be the opposite by saying that heterogeneity is bad and homogeneity is good, but we want to give people the possibility of having that option open to them. As it happens, the critics of homogeneity are also against heterogeneity in some circumstances. They don't like the heterogeneity of ideas, right? They don't basically invite people like us to their dinner tables. They basically like to talk to people who are just like themselves. And that's the paradox. They are really into their own homogeneity, where the voices are echoing one another, and where people agree with each other all the time. So I think that it's useful now and again to point out that these brave diversity individuals, these diversity politicians, like diversity only up to a certain point, but they don't like the diversity of ideas or the diversity of political views when they're being confronted with that.
Can we thank Frank?